Yesterday we saw that Jesus is the climax of the long history of the Old Testament, the one who will fulfill God's promises to Abraham and to David to bless all nations upon earth and to establish God's universal and eternal kingdom of righteousness, justice, and peace. We also saw that whereas Luke traced Jesus' biological descent, Matthew traced Israel's royal succession, so that Joseph was the rightful heir to David's throne. But this raised a problem because it's clear that Jesus was not Joseph's child by birth. How then could Jesus be the legitimate heir of David's throne? The Messiah had to be a descendant of David. If Jesus wasn't, how could he be the Messiah? The answer lies in the detail that it was Joseph, not Mary, who named him Jesus. Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 21 tell us of an angelic annunciation to Joseph about the coming birth of Mary's son. When we speak of an annunciation or the Annunciation, we usually mean the angel Gabriel's message to Mary. But there were in fact three annunciations. An earlier one to Zechariah, recorded in Luke. Zechariah was the father of John the Baptist. The one to Mary, the famous one, and then this later one to Joseph. Joseph found himself in a dilemma. He and Mary were pledged to be married, a commitment regarded as solemn and binding as marriage itself, broken only by death or divorce. However, we read in verse 18 that before they came together to live as husband and wife, Mary was found to be pregnant. Matthew explains that this was by the Holy Spirit, not through normal human sexual intercourse, but neither Joseph nor anyone else apart from Mary herself would know this at the time. And Joseph knew that she wasn't pregnant by him. Such unfaithfulness committed while pledged to be married was regarded as adultery, and by the law of Moses, the penalty for adultery was death. What would happen to the embryonic Jesus if the penalty were actually carried out? Evidently, Joseph decided to spare Mary the full rigour of the law, since in verse 19 we are told that he decided to divorce her quietly. She could have given birth to Jesus quietly too, without having anything more to do with Joseph. But this would not have fulfilled God's purpose, that the Messiah would be the heir of David's throne, and Joseph was absolutely essential to that. When the angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, he specifically addressed him with a royal title, Son of David. A rather unusual form of address for a man who worked at what the Gospels call a tekton in Greek, that is, a craftsman in the building trade. What Matthew is telling us is that Joseph's role and his descent from David were crucial. As one scholar comments, the hero of Matthew's infancy story is Joseph, who is brought through God's revelation to accept Jesus as his own son and heir. In verse 20, Joseph is told that Mary's child is conceived of the Holy Spirit, not by an adulterous liaison. And he is then instructed to do two things. He's to take Mary as his wife, and he is to name her son when he is born. Both are highly significant. To take Mary as his wife and to name her son was, in effect, to acknowledge the baby publicly as his own son. The instruction to name Jesus is emphatic in verse 21. She will bear a son, and you singular, shall call his name Jesus. Joseph's obedience will make Jesus legally his own son, his legitimate heir. And everyone would recognize this to be the case. In fact, later on in the Gospels, people asked about Jesus, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" It was obvious who a child's mother was, but she might lie about the father to avoid being accused of adultery. So paternity was established by the father's acknowledgement of a child. If a man said that a child was his, it was accepted by everyone without question. Joseph legally established Jesus' paternity. And since Joseph himself was David's heir, that made Jesus David's heir as well. In fact, Matthew refers to Jesus as Son of David more often than the other three Gospels put together. As the legal heir to David's throne, Jesus was qualified to be the Messiah. But without Joseph's role in the story, this would never have been so. The angel not only told Joseph to name Jesus and thus claim him as his son and heir, he also told Joseph what name to give him and the reason why. Verse 21, "You shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." Names in the Bible often carry great significance to do with someone's vocation or destiny, and this is no exception. Jesus is the anglicized form of the Greek Jesus, which is the equivalent of the Hebrew Yeshua, which in English is Joshua. It means the Lord's salvation or the Lord saves, and Jesus' vocation and destiny, the angel said, was to save his people from their sins. Matthew then tells us in verse 22 that all this happened so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet who said, "Behold, the virgin will conceive and will bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel," would be fulfilled. Then Matthew explains that Emmanuel means God is with us. The Old Testament text that he quotes is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. So, called Jesus, he will save his people from their sins in fulfillment of a prophecy about a virgin giving birth to a son whom people will call Emmanuel, which signifies that God is with them. What does all this mean? The key to understanding it all is, again, the Old Testament history of Israel, and especially Israel's exile to Babylon. In the Exodus from Egypt, Moses led the Israelites out of captivity to freedom in the Promised Land. But because of their sins, Moses and his generation never entered the land but died in the wilderness. It was in fact Joshua who led the next generation of the people into Canaan, which became the land of Israel. But history repeated itself. The people continued to be disobedient and rebellious, and eventually, because of their sins, they were taken away from the land into another captivity in Babylon. But the prophets foretold a second exodus and a return to the promised land. And Isaiah's prophecy about the virgin bearing a son was all part of the promise of return from exile and restoration to a right relationship with God. "I will be with you" was one of the great promises God made in the Old Testament. It was made to Abraham, to Isaac and Jacob, to Moses when God called him to deliver Israel from Egypt, to Joshua about to lead the people into the promised land, and repeated again and again, especially in prophecies about the return from exile and restoration as the people of God. The people had in fact returned from Babylon 5 centuries earlier, before Jesus was born, and yet, as we can see from Jewish literature of the time, many devout Jews felt that in a spiritual sense, Israel was still in exile, still estranged from God's presence, and still suffering for their sins. Now there is a new Joshua, one who will deliver his people from the captivity of sin and bring them home from spiritual exile, one in whom God will be with his people once again. Jesus was not actually named Emmanuel, but people would recognize that in him God was with them, just as Isaiah foretold. And Jesus himself was to repeat the divine promise to his people. For Matthew ends with the risen Christ sending his disciples out to make disciples of all the nations, to baptize and to teach everything he has commanded, and promising, "Lo, I am with you always to the end of the age." Who could he be who repeats to his own followers the very same promise that God himself made to his people of old? And he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, as the letter to the Hebrews says. The one who was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king is still the Son of David, who will establish God's kingdom of righteousness and peace and joy. He is still the one who delivers his people from their sins, still the one who can bring us home from spiritual exile and restore us to a right relationship with God. He is still God with us, always and forevermore.